Imagine standing on the deck of the most luxurious ship ever built. The air is cold. The ocean is perfectly calm. Above you, thousands of stars fill the night sky. Around you, people are laughing, drinking coffee, talking about their future. Some are planning new lives in America. Some are returning home. Some are simply enjoying what they believe is another peaceful night at sea. What none of them know is that almost every person standing there has less than 3 hours left to live. This is the story of the final hours aboard the Titanic. And the most terrifying part is that, for much of the night, nobody realized they were in danger. April 14th, 1912. The Titanic was crossing the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage from England to New York. At over 880 feet long, it was the largest moving object ever built by humans. Newspapers called it a miracle of engineering. Many people believed it was practically unsinkable. The passengers included some of the richest people on Earth, along with thousands of immigrants, hoping for a better life. For 4 days, everything had gone smoothly. But on the evening of April 14th, several ships in the area sent warnings about icebergs. Message after message arrived. Large ice fields, dangerous conditions, ice directly in Titanic's path. Some warnings reached the bridge. Others never made it to the officers responsible for navigation. Despite the reports, the ship continued at nearly full speed. The sea was unusually calm. There were no waves breaking against the bases of icebergs. That made them much harder to spot. At 11:40 p.m., everything changed. Two lookouts high above the deck suddenly saw something directly ahead, a dark shape, an iceberg. One of them immediately rang the warning bell 3 times, then picked up the phone. Iceberg right ahead. The officers reacted instantly. Hard turn. Engines reversed. But it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship. The impact wasn't dramatic. Many passengers barely felt anything. Some thought they had hit a small wave. Others noticed only a slight vibration. One passenger later joked that it felt as if someone had dragged a giant finger along the side of the ship. There was no panic, no screaming, no visible disaster, but below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had opened a series of small ruptures across multiple compartments. Water began rushing in. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, inspected the damage personally. Within minutes, he reached a devastating conclusion. The Titanic was going to sink. Not might sink. Not possibly sink. Sink. He estimated the ship had perhaps 2 hours left. When Captain Edward Smith heard the assessment, he reportedly stood silent for a moment, then asked a simple question. How long? The answer sealed the fate of everyone on board. Soon after midnight, preparations began. Lifeboats were uncovered. Crew members woke sleeping passengers. But there was a problem, a huge problem. The Titanic carried lifeboats for only about half the people on board. Nobody had expected they would ever be needed. At first, many passengers refused to leave the ship. Why would they? The Titanic looked perfectly safe. The lights were still on. The music was still playing. The ship wasn't visibly sinking. Imagine being told to step into a small wooden boat and lower yourself into a freezing black ocean, or stay aboard a massive, brightly lit ship that seemed completely stable. Many chose to stay. Some lifeboats left half empty. Time was running out. The water continued rising. Down below, crew members fought desperately to keep the ship alive. Engineers remained at their posts. They worked in increasingly dangerous conditions, surrounded by flooding compartments. They knew what was happening. They knew their chances of survival were almost zero, yet they continued supplying electricity to the ship. Their sacrifice kept the lights on and allowed distress signals to be transmitted for precious extra minutes. As the night grew colder, reality began spreading through the ship. Passengers noticed the deck tilting. The bow was sinking lower. People who had ignored earlier warnings suddenly rushed toward the lifeboats. But there were fewer and fewer spaces remaining. Families became separated. Friends lost each other in the confusion. Some passengers searched desperately for loved ones. Others stood frozen, unable to accept what was happening. At approximately 12:45 a.m., the first lifeboat was lowered. The ocean below was dark and silent. The people inside had no idea they were witnessing one of history's greatest disasters. From a distance, the Titanic still appeared magnificent, a floating city of lights, yet every minute brought it closer to destruction. Around 1:30 a.m., the ship's angle became impossible to ignore. Now panic started spreading. Distress rockets shot into the sky. White flares exploded above the ocean. Nearby ships saw them, but no rescue arrived in time. One of the most heartbreaking stories from that night involved the ship's band. Rather than abandoning their positions, the musicians continued playing. Their music drifted across the freezing air while passengers boarded lifeboats. Witnesses remembered hearing melodies, even as the situation became hopeless. Nobody knows exactly what the final song was, but many survivors never forgot the sound. By 2 a.m., the end was approaching rapidly. The bow had disappeared beneath the ocean. Water flooded through hallways, staircases, and luxury cabins. Furniture slid across rooms, glass shattered. People clung to railings as the angle became steeper and steeper. Some passengers jumped into the sea. Others remained on board until the very last moments. The freezing Atlantic water was only around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the normal freezing point of fresh water because of its salt content. Anyone entering that water faced almost impossible odds. Then came the final minutes. The stern rose high into the air. From the lifeboats, survivors watched in horror. The enormous ship that had been called unsinkable now pointed toward the stars. For a brief moment, it seemed suspended between sky and ocean. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. Imagine the silence. Thousands of people holding their breath. Nothing but cold wind and distant cries. Moments later, the Titanic broke apart. The sections disappeared beneath the surface. At 2:20 a.m., just 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg, the ship was gone. But the nightmare wasn't over. More than 1,000 people were now in the freezing ocean. The sounds that followed haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Cries for help, voices calling names, people begging to be rescued. One survivor later said the screaming was the most awful sound he had ever heard. Within minutes, the cold began taking lives. One by one, the voices faded, until eventually there was almost complete silence. The North Atlantic became still again. The stars remained overhead, the same stars that had watched the disaster unfold. Hours later, rescue ship passengers would arrive to find lifeboats scattered across a dark, empty sea. Of the more than 2,200 people aboard Titanic, over 1,500 died. It remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. More than a century has passed since that night. Yet the story continues to fascinate people around the world. Not because of the ship itself, but because of the people. The engineers who stayed behind, the musicians who kept playing, the families who faced impossible choices, and the terrifying reminder that sometimes history changes forever in a single moment. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic was the greatest ship on Earth. By 2:20 a.m., it was resting at the bottom of the Atlantic. And for everyone aboard, those final hours became a story the world would never forget.